A man was spotted running down the middle of a rural road as if someone were chasing him. He had no idea he was being filmed. The man was cradling a bundled blanket, and in his hands were tiny wild bobcat kittens, their eyes still sealed shut, each no bigger than a fist. He stumbled forward, his legs finally giving out, and collapsed right in the middle of the asphalt. As reporters rushed over, the man began to look confused and concerned. What was he doing with newborn wild bobcats? And what else was hidden in that blanket? When his trembling hands lifted the layers to reveal what was underneath, everyone was astonished. It was something you have to see to believe, and the reason he had them is a story that will leave you speechless. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The October morning broke crystal clear over the Blue Ridge foothills of rural Virginia, with that particular quality of light that only comes in autumn, golden and sharp-edged, painting every leaf and blade of grass with precise definition. Matt Sullivan stood on his back porch, steam rising from his coffee mug into the crisp air, watching the sun climb above the tree line. At 30 years old, he had the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors, but the gentle eyes of a man who still stopped to move turtles off country roads. His property sat on 12 acres of mixed woodland and meadow, bordered by County Road 847 on the north side and the Jefferson National Forest to the south. It was the kind of place where you could go days without seeing another person if you wanted to, where the loudest sounds were usually just the wind through the pines and the occasional call of a red-tailed hawk. Matt had moved here 3 years ago after inheriting the land from his grandmother, trading his apartment in Richmond for this quiet corner of Augusta County where the nearest neighbor was a half-mile away. The morning routine was always the same. Coffee on the porch, a walk around the property to check the fence line, then into his workshop where he restored antique furniture, a business that allowed him to work from home and set his own hours. But for the past 4 months, there had been an addition to this routine, one that filled him with a mixture of wonder and responsibility. She first appeared in June, a shadow moving through the tall grass at dusk. Matt had been grilling dinner when he spotted her, a female bobcat, her spotted coat catching the last rays of sunlight as she stalked something he couldn't see. He'd frozen, hardly daring to breathe, watching as she pounced on what turned out to be a field mouse. She was magnificent, all coiled muscle and wild grace, her tufted ears swiveling like radar dishes as she consumed her prey. Over the following weeks, she became a regular visitor. Matt learned her patterns: early morning hunts along the meadow edge, afternoon naps in the shade of the old oak tree, evening prowls through the brush pile he'd been meaning to clear, but now left specifically for her. He started calling her Lady, though he never said the name aloud, as if speaking it might break the spell of her presence. By late July, Matt noticed changes. Lady's belly had begun to swell, her movements becoming more deliberate, less acrobatic. She was pregnant. The realization hit him with unexpected force. This wild creature had chosen to remain near his home during her most vulnerable time. It was a trust he didn't take lightly. He did his research, calling the Wildlife Center of Virginia for advice, reading everything he could find about bobcat behavior and reproduction. He learned that females typically gave birth to litters of 2 to 4 kittens after a gestation period of about 60 days. The kittens would be born blind and helpless, completely dependent on their mother for the first 2 months of life. He learned to recognize the signs of denning behavior, the searching for secure, hidden spots, the gathering of soft materials. When Lady began collecting moss and pine straw in early September, carrying mouthfuls to the dense thicket at the edge of his property, Matt knew she'd chosen her nursery. The bramble patch was perfect, thick enough to provide cover, elevated slightly to avoid flooding, with multiple escape routes if needed. It was also only about 40 yards from his back fence, close enough that he could keep a protective eye on the area without intruding. Matt set up a trail camera at a respectful distance, allowing him to monitor without disturbing. He placed a large water trough nearby, one of those heavy rubber livestock containers that wouldn't tip easily, keeping it filled with fresh water daily. When hunting looked scarce, during a particularly harsh week of rain, he left out raw chicken pieces on a flat rock, far enough from the den that Lady would have to leave her eventual kittens to retrieve it, maintaining her wild instincts. The morning of October 15th started like any other, bright and clear with a northwest wind that brought the smell of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Matt had noticed Lady hadn't emerged for 2 days, and the trail camera confirmed she was staying close to the den. Labor must be near, or perhaps had already begun. His neighbor to the west, Jim Harrison, was burning brush that day, something he did every fall to clear his pastures. Matt had seen the smoke column rising white and steady against the blue sky, had even thought about walking over to help. But Jim was particular about his burns, always keeping them contained within his metal fire ring, always having his hose ready. 20 years of farming had made him careful. But even careful people couldn't account for everything. The wind, which had been gentle all morning, suddenly gusted hard from the west. Matt was in his workshop, sanding down an oak table, when he heard it. That sudden roar of air that made the walls creak. Through the window, he saw Jim's burn pile explode in a shower of sparks, embers lifting like orange snow, swirling up and out in all directions. Most of them died in the air, winking out harmlessly. But Matt watched in growing horror as several larger pieces, still glowing red, sailed over Jim's fence line and into the dry leaves that carpeted the woodland edge. The drought that summer had left everything tinder dry. The leaves hadn't seen real rain in 3 weeks. The first wisps of smoke were almost innocent looking, thin gray threads rising from the leaf litter. Then, with terrifying speed, those threads became ribbons, the ribbons became clouds, and suddenly there was a line of flame racing along the ground, feeding on years of accumulated forest debris. Matt's hands were already reaching for his phone, dialing 911 as he ran from the workshop. "Fire at 2847 County Road 847, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Spreading fast from the Harrison property into the woods. Send everything you've got." The dispatcher confirmed, but Matt knew the reality. The nearest fire station was 12 miles away in Waynesboro. Even racing with lights and sirens, they'd need at least 15 minutes to arrive. He looked at the fire line, calculated its speed and direction, and felt his blood turn to ice. The wind was pushing it directly toward Lady's den. Matt dropped the phone and ran to his utility shed, grabbing the heavy wool blanket he used for moving furniture in a large plastic laundry basket. He soaked the blanket with the garden hose until it was dripping, then threw it over his shoulder. The wet wool was heavy, maybe 30 pounds, but he barely noticed the weight as he sprinted toward the thicket. The smoke hit him when he was still 20 yards away, thick and choking, making his eyes stream. He pulled his t-shirt up over his nose and mouth, pushing forward through the increasingly dense haze. The crackling sound was louder now, punctuated by the explosive pops of pine sap boiling in burning trees. He could feel the heat on his exposed skin, like standing too close to a campfire, except this fire was still dozens of yards away and closing fast. When Matt reached the den entrance, what he saw made his heart simultaneously break and surge with desperate purpose. Lady was there, lying on her side in a shallow depression she'd carved in the earth. Her flanks were heaving with exhaustion, her golden eyes glazed with the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes after tremendous physical effort. Pressed against her belly were three tiny forms, still wet, their spotted coats matted down, each no bigger than Matt's fist. She had just given birth. The kittens couldn't have been more than an hour or two old. In normal circumstances, a mother bobcat would have immediately moved her kittens at the first sign of danger, carrying them one by one in her mouth to safety. But Lady couldn't stand. The birth had drained her completely. Matt could see the trembling in her legs when she tried to rise, the way she collapsed back down immediately. She looked at him with those wild eyes, and in them he saw something that transcended species. The desperate plea of a mother who knew she couldn't save her children. "I've got you, Mama," Matt said, his voice rough from the smoke. "I'm going to get you all out of here." The fire's roar was getting louder, the smoke thicker. Embers were beginning to fall like hellish snow, landing on the dry brush around them. Matt knew he had maybe 2 minutes, probably less. He spread the soaked blanket on the ground and gently, carefully lifted Lady onto it. She didn't fight him. Whether from exhaustion, trust, or simple inability, he'd never know. She must have weighed 35 pounds, all lean muscle and fur. The 3 kittens he tucked against her belly, their tiny mews barely audible over the fire's voice. He wrapped the blanket around them all, creating a protective cocoon with a small gap for air. Standing with the bundle cradled in his arms, Matt turned to retreat the way he'd come, only to find a wall of smoke so thick he couldn't see more than 3 feet. The fire had flanked him while he was focused on the rescue, cutting off his escape route back to the house. Panic clawed at his throat, but he forced it down. Think. The county road. It ran along the north edge of the woods, maybe 200 yards through the forest. If he could reach it, he'd be on the other side of the fire line. It would mean pushing through dense undergrowth while carrying 40 pounds of bobcats and wet blanket, half blind from smoke, but it was the only option that didn't involve running directly toward the flames. Matt oriented himself by the sound of the fire, keeping it to his left, and began pushing through the brush. Branches tore at his clothes and skin, leaving bloody scratches he wouldn't notice until later. His lungs burned with each breath, the smoke searing his throat. The wrapped bundle in his arms grew heavier with each step, his muscles screaming from the awkward weight distribution. Twice he stumbled, going to one knee but managing to keep the precious cargo stable. The heat was incredible now, like being inside an oven. His exposed skin felt tight and hot, his eyes streaming constantly. Through the blanket, he could feel Lady's rapid breathing, could hear the tiny sounds of the kittens. They were still alive. That's all that mattered. Just when Matt thought he couldn't go another step, when his vision was starting to gray at the edges from lack of oxygen, he burst through the last line of trees onto the blessed openness of County Road 847. He stumbled forward, his legs finally giving out, and fell to his knees in the middle of the asphalt, still cradling the bundled bobcats against his chest. What Matt didn't know was that 30 seconds earlier, a Channel 6 news van had pulled up to cover what they thought would be a routine wildfire story. Reporter Jennifer Lawson and her cameraman, Pete Rodriguez, had just arrived from covering a different story, a feel-good piece about a new playground in Staunton. Their dash camera was still running, as it always was, company policy for insurance purposes. The camera captured everything in crystal clear high definition. A man emerging from a wall of smoke like something out of a nightmare. His clothes torn and blackened, his face streaked with soot and tears. It showed him falling to his knees in the road, hunched protectively over a large bundle wrapped in a charred blanket. And then, as he carefully set the bundle down and began to unwrap it, the camera captured something extraordinary. Matt gently lifted two tiny bobcat kittens from the blanket, holding them up to examine them in the clearer air. Each kitten was impossibly small, their eyes still sealed shut, their oversized paws hanging limp. For a heart-stopping moment, they were completely still. Then one mewed, a sound so thin and small it was almost lost in the distant roar of the fire, and began to move weakly. The second followed suit, tiny pink tongue visible as it yawned. "Are they alive?" Jennifer had jumped from the van, her reporter instincts overridden by simple human concern. "They're breathing," Matt said, his voice barely a whisper, raw from smoke. "The mom, too. She's in the blanket. She just gave birth. Couldn't run." Pete grabbed fire extinguishers from the van while Jennifer called for an ambulance. For Matt, who was clearly suffering from smoke inhalation, and additional fire support. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with first responders. The fire crew immediately went to work creating a fire break while EMTs checked Matt's oxygen levels and treated his burns. First degree on his arms and neck, nothing serious but painful. Matt refused to leave until he knew the bobcats were safe. A Virginia State police officer who happened to be a trained wildlife handler carefully transferred Lady and her kittens to a special carrier that the fire chief had in his truck. He'd been a volunteer with wildlife rescue for years. Lady was conscious but weak, allowing herself to be moved without resistance. Her kittens pressed against her. The Wildlife Center of Virginia was only 40 minutes away in Waynesboro. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the head veterinarian, had already been alerted and was preparing an emergency intake room. When the Bobcat family arrived, her team was ready. Lady was severely dehydrated and exhausted, but had no serious injuries. The birth had been textbook normal. It was simply terrible timing that the fire had come when she was at her most vulnerable. The three kittens, two females and a male, had inhaled some smoke, but their lungs were clear. They were small but healthy, their weights normal for newborns. If he'd been 5 minutes later, Dr. Mitchell told Matt when he visited the next day, his arms wrapped in bandages, we'd be having a very different conversation. The smoke alone would have killed the kittens, and the mother would have died trying to save them. The news story aired that evening, the dashcam footage going viral within hours. Local man risks life to save Bobcat family became the feel-good story that people desperately needed. Donations poured into the Wildlife Center, enough to fund their operations for the next 2 years. Matt, uncomfortable with the attention, declined all interview requests except one, where he simply said, "Anyone would have done the same." But not everyone would have. Not everyone would have noticed a pregnant bobcat choosing to den near their home. Not everyone would have respectfully maintained her water source and occasionally supplemented her hunting. Not everyone would have run toward a wildfire instead of away from it. The rehabilitation process took 5 months. Lady, officially designated as patient number 24-3847, recovered quickly, her wild instincts intact. She was a fierce mother, protective of her kittens even in captivity, teaching them to hunt using the live prey the center provided once they were old enough. The kittens, tagged with colored markers as green, the male, yellow, and blue, the females, grew from tiny, helpless bundles into miniature versions of their mother. All sharp claws and attitude. Matt visited twice, both times staying back while Dr. Mitchell checked on the family. Lady watched him during these visits, her golden eyes unreadable. He liked to think there was recognition there, maybe even gratitude. But he knew better than to anthropomorphize. She was wild, and that's how she needed to stay. The release day came in March, when the kittens were 5 months old and fully capable of surviving on their own. The location had been carefully chosen, a protected area in the George Washington National Forest, far from roads and human habitation, with plenty of prey and water sources. Matt was invited to witness the release. He stood with Dr. Mitchell and her team at the forest edge as the carriers were positioned. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything gold, the air warm with the promise of spring. "Ready?" Dr. Mitchell asked. Matt nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. The carrier doors were opened remotely. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Lady emerged, low and cautious, her head swiveling as she assessed this new environment. Behind her, 3 smaller forms appeared. Her kittens, now half her size, their coats perfect camouflage against the leaf litter. Lady took 3 steps forward, then paused. She turned her head and looked directly at Matt, holding his gaze for one long moment. Then she chirped. A soft, rolling sound that bobcats use to communicate with their young, and bounded into the underbrush. Her kittens followed instantly, their spotted forms vanishing into the shadows like smoke. Within seconds, it was as if they'd never been there at all. Matt stood there for a long time after everyone else had left, listening to the forest, watching the place where they'd disappeared. The burn scar from October's fire was still visible on his property, a black slash through the green, but already new growth was pushing through. Life persisting, adapting, continuing. That evening, Matt sat on his back porch with a beer, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The bramble thicket where Lady had denned was gone, consumed by the fire. But he'd already decided not to clear the burned area. Let it grow back wild, he thought. Let it become shelter again for whatever creature needed it. His phone buzzed with another message from a reporter wanting to do a follow-up story, to know how it felt to be a hero. He deleted it without responding. Heroes were people who did extraordinary things. All he'd done was recognize that sometimes the distance between human and wild is smaller than we think, and that kindness doesn't require a common language. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Matt heard it. A distant call from the forest, that distinctive chirping growl of a bobcat declaring territory. It could have been any bobcat, he told himself. The mountains were full of them. But his heart knew better. Somewhere out there, Lady and her kittens were learning the ancient rhythms of the wild. They would hunt and hide, grow and thrive, living the lives they were meant to live. And sometimes, on quiet nights like this one, when the wind was just right, Matt would hear that call and remember the weight of trust in his arms, the fierce love in a mother's eyes, and the moment when the only thing that mattered was carrying something precious through the smoke towards safety. The trail camera he'd set up near a creek a mile into the forest sometimes captured images of bobcats. Most were strangers passing through, but occasionally, very occasionally, there would be one with a particular pattern of spots on her left shoulder, a certain way of carrying her head. And sometimes she would be accompanied by 3 younger cats, learning to be wild under her watchful eye. Matt never mentioned these sightings to anyone. Some gifts are too precious to share, some connections too profound to explain. He simply continued his quiet life on the mountain, maintaining his water sources, respecting the boundaries between wild and tame, and knowing that somewhere out there, a family lived because on one terrible October day, when the world was burning and time was running out, 2 species had trusted each other just long enough to matter. The scar from the fire would fade with time, covered by new growth, forgotten by all but those who knew where to look. But the bond forged in that moment of crisis, between a man and a wild mother, between human compassion and animal trust, that would endure in the silent acknowledgement of shared space, in the occasional glimpse of spotted fur, in the call across darkness that said, "I remember, I survived, I continue." And in the end, perhaps that's all any of us can hope for, to be remembered by those we've helped, to know that our actions mattered, and to understand that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones that honor the distance between us while celebrating the moment when that distance disappeared.